The Game Boy Color has no backlight, which is great for battery life, but sometimes this can make it a challenge to see the screen and play. Though I've also learned that means the location where you play really matters, whether it's outside on a warm sunny day, or that spot on the couch near the lamp that gives you the best light. It's the environment around you that becomes part of the Game Boy Color experience. I've really come to appreciate this part of the experience recently, but this also gives me a unique challenge to face. It's really difficult to capture the full Game Boy Color experience on camera. There's just so much reflection and uneven shadows on the screen when getting a shot. If I try to bring a light into a frame, which in filmmaking this is called using a motivated light source, including lights in a scene is supposed to make the setting feel more natural, but I don't think this helps me at all. So for this video, I'm going to do something a bit different than I usually do. I'm going to be using a newer piece of hardware to help make this video. In this case, it's a Game Boy with a modern backlit display, but not a Nintendo Game Boy. This is an FPGA-based Game Boy. FPGA means this is simulating the actual hardware of the Game Boy itself. In many ways, it's really good that new hardware is coming out that so closely matches the original hardware of the Game Boy Color. And the FPGA-based design offers a higher level of compatibility over standard emulation. Though for Game Boy games, that's not much of an issue these days. And as for playing Game Boy games on a backlit LCD, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Though I do have a couple of personal reservations here. One is the oversaturation of colours. That happens because these games were designed for a reflective LCD that tended to mute any colour quite a bit, and so game developers would push the saturation in their colours quite high to compensate. This makes me wish there were more options to reduce colour saturation on these FPGA-based Game Boys. Also, and this is a much more subjective concern, some games just feel like they should be played on a non-backlit screen. For making this video, I've also replaced the front lens on my original and beautiful midnight blue Game Boy Color. And so before sticking it down, I've been experimenting with recording the screen without having a lens in front to add extra reflection artifacts. I wanted to get some really good close-up images. What makes this simple display so beautiful? How can a device of such limited ability be so interesting? Why do so many people hold this dearly in their hearts? Welcome to the Game Boy Color, regarded by many as one of the best game consoles of all time. I had to find out these answers for myself. I decided to take my own journey with the GBC. While I had an original Game Boy at the time, I didn't upgrade to the Game Boy Color when it came out. At the time, the GBC was, well, not as interesting as most of the other hardware that was coming out in the late 90s, such as the PlayStation or the Nintendo 64. I just thought the GBC was kind of old hat, which to be honest, it kind of is. Even though it came out 9 years after the original Game Boy, it's still very much of the same design, based on the same tech, with the same old-style tile-based graphics. Though the CPU speed was doubled from 4 to 8 MHz, and the RAM was doubled from 16 to 32 kilobytes. But with the same 160 by 144 pixel display as the original Game Boy, just this time it was colour. That's not to say this was a bad move by Nintendo. With backwards compatibility and with a huge library of original Game Boy games, and an easy-to-develop for platform, this was actually a very clever move by Nintendo. And a huge number of colour-only games ended up being developed for this console. And remember, it's the games that matter, not the specs of the device you play them on. I've only recently been able to dive into this console and the huge library of interesting games available. All these games that I never got to try at the time. To do this, I'm using this generic and rather cheap flash card, which came with a 2GB micro SD card. As well as the many Game Boy Color games, this also gives me the ability to play many of my old favourites thanks to the GBC having original Game Boy compatibility, including the original Super Mario Land, with its weird physics and tiny sprites. Despite having only a very small Mario character on screen and tiny sprites in general, I really like the way this makes the game world feel large and expansive by comparison. One big advantage of using a flash cart to play these games is that now I can use things like Game Genie codes. This is something I never had or was able to try back in the day. To use a Game Genie code, I just need to use some ROM patching software. This will patch Genie codes directly and permanently into a ROM. So with Super Mario Land, I now have access to the level select option. I always thought it was a bit unfair that you had to beat Super Mario Land twice, once in normal mode and then again in hard mode to get access to the level select function. And once the system is powered off, that option is lost. But now I have a patched ROM with level select, and I can directly go and play my favourite levels at any time. But really, it's the new patches that have been coming out for some of these games that are really interesting, such as the many graphics colorization mods and ROM hacks. For example, Super Mario Land DX. This patches the game's graphics into a real Game Boy Color game, and it looks amazing. There's even an option to switch to more modern sprite designs for the characters. But I have to confess that personally, I prefer the original sprites. The nostalgia of this game is strong with me. And playing this, I must admit that the colour choices look really good, even on backlit displays. Each level has well thought out colour palettes. This is a great way to enjoy one of the best, but strangest Mario games of all time. Not all the ROM hacks that have been made are colour-based mods. Here's another game for the original Game Boy, called Faceball 2000. This is a really interesting first-person shooter with puzzle elements. Really the only problem with this game is the speed of the 3D graphics. Running on an original Game Boy, this always had a fairly slow frame rate. This is until you apply some of the new ROM hacks that can speed up Faceball 2000 on a Game Boy Color. This is done by running the game in the GBC's full 8 MHz CPU mode, making it much more playable. This is version 2 of the mod, but I actually kind of prefer the earlier version 1 of this mod, which has an even higher frame rate. This does come with quite a lot of graphical glitches, though I kind of like that. Of course, I'm not just here to play old games. The Game Boy Color has such a huge library of its own games, including a large number of exclusive games only ever made available on the GBC. There are just so many to try though. Here is Road to El Dorado, a great example of what the Game Boy Color is capable of, despite the limited hardware. Programmers really knew how to take advantage of this design. And of course, I've been meaning to try out Rayman, a game that I've only tried out in weird ports to other systems, such as this Nokia phone, and PalmOS running on this Sony PDA. I also had a go with Tetris DX. This is Nintendo's newer version of Tetris made specifically for the Game Boy Color. And I must admit, there are definitely some improvements over the original Game Boy version. The piece handling is very much improved, and I like the variations on the game they provide. But I'm a real sucker for nostalgia sometimes, and this made me want to play the original Tetris, for which there is a colorized patch to give the pieces their own unique colors. I just had to try this out as well, including playing Game B on level 9 with a high of 5. It took quite a few attempts to get there, but eventually I did it, and I was able to see the space shuttle take off again after all this time. There are just so many games for this system, it's hard to know which ones to try. I did watch some best Game Boy games lists videos, and doing that I found this game Toki Tori. This is a later game for the Game Boy Color, and quite a nice platform puzzler that's worth playing. I tend to look for interesting and unique games. I like to find things that go off the beaten path in different ways. So for this I delved into the world of Homebrew. One Homebrew game I found that looks interesting and only came out a couple of years ago is The Mayor of Sanctuary. I quite like the feel of this game. It's spooky and weird. I haven't had a chance to play it that much yet, but I'm intrigued so far. Another Homebrew I tried is called Ludaire OS. This is not really an operating system, it's more a piece of entertainment where you explore a fictional OS. It has different things to try as you explore and secrets to find. It's definitely something very different. I really like all the different creative ideas that come out through the Homebrew scene. One very interesting game that I found is called Slowly Fading into Data. This is a very weird game indeed. Or should I say, experience? I admit I barely know what's going on, but I'm very intrigued. This is exactly the sort of thing that I like to find. It's by exploring and trying new things that we learn. Sometimes we find ourselves going down the wrong path and have to double back. But this is not a mistake. It's how we gain experience and move forward in a better way. I didn't know exactly what I would find exploring the GBC. I only knew that the GBC is already one of the most explored and known portable devices on the planet. I didn't know if there was much left for me to find. But I did find something. I found that my own journey and experience of these things is what matters. And there are just so many games that I also need to try. Well, there's also quite a lot of Homebrew that I need to try. I don't know how I'm going to get through it all. I never played Pokemon back in the day, but how can you try a Game Boy Color without at least giving it a go? Another game I found that's well known, but it's more known for its intro than anything else, is Cannon Fodder, which runs full motion video as part of its intro sequence. This is very interesting. I didn't realize that the Game Boy Color was capable of doing something like this. This made me really want to try doing this for myself. So I searched around online and found that someone had indeed written a script that can re-encode video and audio, and then package that into a Game Boy Color ROM. The script is now 6 years old, and it's more of a proof of concept than a complete package. So I set about seeing if I can get this to work. It was tricky to get everything set up, and then of course it didn't work. One of the main problems is compatibility with other system components that it needs, such as the newer versions of FFmpeg that don't seem to work with this. But with a bit of effort, I was able to modify the makefile, and I was able to get it running, and then finally compile a working GBC ROM. But with one small problem. The playback video looks quite distorted. I can barely see what's going on. But now look what happens when I try this on original hardware instead. And wow, there we go. I've now got video playback working on the Game Boy Color. This is amazing for a system with such limited hardware specifications. And it's awesome to see this running firsthand. Though with a maximum ROM size of 8 megabytes, only about 1 minute of video will fit on here. There must be some sort of incompatibility in the FPGA Game Boy clone that can't handle whatever this code is doing to display graphics. It's not a major concern though. Game compatibility is really good on this clone, and I'm sure that some obscure video playback code is not an important factor with that. The Game Boy uses a special graphics system based on tiled graphics and sprites. This works well for the sort of games that run on here, but to get video playback, this must have been adapted in a way that produces a pseudo full-screen bitmap display to display these images. I wonder if this technique of generating a pseudo bitmap display was how one of my favourite Game Boy Color demo scene demos also works. This demo from 2021 is stunning. It's running decent frame rate, almost full-screen 3D graphics on a Game Boy Color. This should simply not be possible on a system as limited as this, yet here we are. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color both run the Z80 CPU, which is actually my favourite 8-bit CPU of all time. I understand this might be somewhat controversial to say, because the 6502 is generally regarded as a much better 8-bit CPU. But for me, it's more about the devices that use the Z80. Some I've shown here on the channel already, others are yet to be seen. I've also done some Z80 programming in the past, and I intend to do more in the future on some very interesting devices, so let's see where that goes. Until then, let me know what you think of this console. Are there any unique or unusual games that I must try out? And most importantly, what is the best portable console of all time? But that's it for the moment, and I'll see you next time.